Lakeview Meadows was the kind of neighborhood where people took pride in their homes. Perfectly cut lawns, white fences, and flower beds lined the quiet streets. But one morning, everything changed. Every single house had a bright red sticker slapped across the front door. Toxic mold hazard, unsafe until remediated. The notices looked so official that most residents assumed the city or state health department had issued them. In reality, this was nothing more than a carefully planned scam. And behind it all was Karen Blake, the HOA president who craved control more than anything else. Karen thrived on power. To her, the HOA wasn't about maintaining order, it was about keeping neighbors under her thumb. Now she had found a brand new way to scare them into submission. As residents poured out of their homes in panic, Karen strutted down the street like she was a government inspector. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, she raised her voice for maximum effect. "This is a public health emergency. Your homes are unsafe. Black mold has been detected. If you don't act now, your houses could be condemned." The crowd gasped. Mothers clutched their children. Elderly couples looked ready to faint, and people whispered in fear. Before anyone could process, Karen offered a solution. She announced, "I've already contacted Everpure Environmental. They're certified experts. They'll start inspections today. Only $5,000 per household. If you refuse, the HOA will have no choice but to declare your property unsafe and fine you." The panic did its job. Within minutes, a few frightened residents were already signing her clipboard. Karen smiled, satisfied as though she'd won a game she had rigged all along. But not everyone bought it. From the window of his two-story home, Mark Adler was watching. A retired engineer with a sharp, analytical mind, Mark didn't fall for fear tactics easily. Something felt wrong. He muttered to himself, if this was real, the city's health department would be here. There would be hazmat suits, official trucks, real testing equipment, not this circus. His suspicions grew when he noticed the so-called experts from Everpure loitering by the community gate. Two shady-looking men with beat-up gear and a rusted van whose logo was half-faded. They didn't look like licensed professionals. They looked like con men. Mark grabbed a notebook and began writing down everything. He watched as Karen bullied an older man, Mr. Benson, into compliance by saying, "Mold is invisible, sir. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there." He saw Mrs. Dalloway crying in her garden, holding her children, terrified of losing their home. Fear was spreading faster than any mold could. That night, while most of the neighborhood tried to sleep through the anxiety, Mark spotted something even more telling. From his upstairs window, he saw Karen meeting quietly with a man he assumed was the owner of Everpure, Dennis Cole. Mark noticed her slipping a small box into Dennis's hands. Dennis tucked it quickly into the back of his van, glancing around to make sure no one else saw. To Mark, the truth was obvious. This wasn't about health, it was about money. Karen was running a kickback scheme, and in that moment, Mark made up his mind. He wasn't going to sit back while his neighbors were robbed blind. If Karen wanted to play dirty, then he was going to expose her scam from the inside, and this time she wouldn't see it coming. Mark knew exposing Karen wouldn't be easy. She was cunning, manipulative, and had the entire HOA board wrapped around her finger. If he confronted her directly, she'd twist the story and turn the neighborhood against him. He needed evidence, solid, undeniable proof, and to get it, he had to think like an engineer and a strategist. The first step was surveillance. Mark converted his garage into a small command center. He ordered discreet wireless cameras and disguised them inside birdhouses, porch lights, and even a sprinkler system casing. Each camera fed live video back to his laptop, allowing him to track movement across the cul-de-sac without anyone suspecting. From his workshop, he could see exactly who was coming and going, especially near Karen's house and the Everpure van. But cameras weren't enough. If Karen claimed toxic mold, then Mark would fight fire with science. He collected dust samples from his own home and from his friend's property across town. He sent both to an independent state-certified lab under his own name. When the results came back, the findings were crystal clear. No hazardous mold detected, zero contamination. This was the smoking gun he needed to prove that Everpure wasn't testing anything legitimately. The final piece of the puzzle was law enforcement. Mark had an old friend on the county police force, Detective Harper, a straight shooter who hated scams almost as much as Mark did. Mark shared everything: the fake notices, the shady contractors, the kickback meeting he had witnessed. Harper didn't dismiss him. Instead, the detective said, "We've had complaints about similar scams, but never this organized. If you can lure them into making a move, we'll be ready to step in." That gave Mark an idea. He would stage a trap that Karen and her crew couldn't resist. He pretended to be worried, just like his neighbors, and signed up for an inspector. Ion with Everpure. But before the appointment, he rigged his living room with hidden microphones and a small motion-activated camera tucked between his bookshelf and a vase. He even sprinkled a fluorescent dye, visible only under UV light, across the corners of his vents. If the so-called inspectors claimed they had found mold in those exact spots, he'd know for certain they were lying. Karen, confident in her scheme, personally scheduled the appointment. Two men from Everpure, Gary and Kevin, arrived late at night in their dented van, wearing overalls that looked more like Halloween costumes than safety gear. Mark welcomed them politely, but inside his pulse was steady, almost calm. This is it, he thought. Tonight, the cracks start to show. The men pulled out cheap flashlights and plastic swabs, poking randomly around the living room. Within minutes, one of them announced, "Yeah, this place is loaded with toxic spores. You're gonna need a full remediation. Could run you about $12,000. He scribbled numbers onto a fake invoice pad while Kevin pretended to test the vents. What they didn't realize was that the fluorescent dye was now on their gloves. The moment they left, Mark snapped photos under UV light, showing proof they hadn't found mold. They had planted it on themselves. Mark's cameras caught everything: the fake testing, the phony invoice, and the men reporting back to Karen afterward. And the best part? Detective Harper's team was already watching from an unmarked car down the block. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a surge of confidence. The pieces were finally falling into place. Karen thought she had scared her neighborhood into submission, but what she didn't know was that her empire of lies was about to collapse because Mark had just set the perfect trap. The trap was set, but Mark knew one sting wasn't enough. He needed Karen's people to incriminate themselves in real time, with no wiggle room for excuses. A week later, the perfect opportunity came. Karen had been strutting around the neighborhood, telling residents that Mark's property was ground zero for toxic infestation. She even hinted that the county might condemn his house if he didn't cooperate. What she didn't know was that Mark had already shared her threats with Detective Harper, who was quietly working to obtain a warrant. All they needed was a decisive break-in, one more reckless move from her crew. That moment arrived late on a stormy Thursday night. At 2:17 a.m., Mark's motion-activated cameras caught Gary and Kevin creeping across his lawn, flashlights bouncing in the rain. They weren't carrying any real testing gear, just a duffel bag stuffed with jars of black powder, spray bottles, and a portable fogger. The plan was clear. They would seed his house with mold and then claim to have discovered it later, fabricating the emergency that would line their pockets. Mark stayed quiet in his upstairs office, watching the feed from his laptop with his headphones pressed tight. His heart hammered, but his face stayed calm. He had already alerted Harper, who was waiting a few blocks away with 2 patrol cars. Mark's role was simple: let the men incriminate themselves, then make the call. The moment Gary forced open a basement window, Mark dialed. Within minutes, unmarked cruisers glided silently into the cul-de-sac. The men inside had no idea the trap had sprung. Kevin climbed halfway into the basement, clutching the fogger, when blinding floodlights snapped on and officers shouted, "Police, drop everything, hands where we can see them." The look on their faces was priceless, pure panic. Gary stumbled backward into the mud, cursing, while Kevin froze in the window frame. Officers swarmed in, pinning them both to the ground before they could destroy the bag of evidence. The duffel was seized, and inside it were dozens of jars labeled Sample A, Sample B, and so on, each preloaded with the same harmless powder Karen had been passing off as deadly mold spores. The arrest sent a shockwave through the neighborhood. People who had been terrified days earlier now stood on their porches, bathrobes tied loose, watching as the so-called inspectors were shoved into squad cars. Some neighbors gasped, others whispered, but all eyes eventually turned to Karen's house across the street. For the first time, she wasn't smiling. At the station, Gary and Kevin crumbled almost instantly. Faced with the evidence, they admitted everything. The fake samples, the staged inspections, even the kickbacks funneled through Karen. They weren't masterminds, just hired hands promised a cut of the profits. And when detectives pressed harder, they revealed that Karen herself had orchestrated the scheme with a man named Dennis Cole, an HOA consultant with a history of shady contracts. Word spread fast. By morning, homeowners who had once lined up to sign Karen's remediation contracts were demanding refunds, furious that she had preyed on their fears. Mark's suspicion had become fact, backed by video, lab reports, and sworn testimony. Karen's web of lies was unraveling faster than she could spin new ones. But even as the community celebrated the arrests, Mark knew this was only the beginning. Gary and Kevin were pawns. The real power still rested with Karen and Dennis, the ones who had turned a neighborhood HOA into a personal racket. And Mark wasn't going to stop until the Queen herself was cornered. The arrests of Gary and Kevin were the crack in the dam. But when it burst, it took the entire HOA empire down with it. Detective Harper moved quickly, seizing the duffel bag and sending every jar of toxic mold powder to the state environmental lab. Within days, the results came back. Not a single sample contained dangerous spores. Most of it was harmless drywall dust mixed with charcoal powder. The whole infestation had been a carefully staged illusion, designed to terrify homeowners into handing over checks. That lab report was the nail in the coffin, irrefutable science against Karen's endless spin. But the real blow came from inside the HOA itself. Bill Granger, the longtime treasurer, had always been Karen's shadow, quiet, loyal, and seemingly harmless. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he cracked like glass. Bill admitted he had been laundering money through HOA accounts for years, funneling inspection fees and remediation payments into shell companies that led straight back to Karen and her partner, Dennis Cole. Dennis wasn't just some outside consultant. He was a former HOA president from another county, booted after a corruption scandal, who had reinvented himself as a compliance advisor. Together, he and Karen had turned paranoia into profit, bleeding neighbors dry under the banner of community safety. Bill's confession was devastating. He produced receipts, bank transfers, even personal emails where Karen bragged about keeping the sheep scared. He also revealed something no one expected. Karen had been pushing a proposal to take out a second mortgage on HOA-owned common land, using it as collateral for a massive loan she and Dennis planned to siphon off before vanishing. It wasn't just fraud anymore, it was theft on a scale that could bankrupt the neighborhood for decades. The community erupted when news of Bill's testimony spread. Homeowners who had once applauded Karen at meetings now shouted her down, demanding answers. Parents who had been too afraid to let their kids play outside because of the supposed mold crisis realized they'd been manipulated. Retirees who had paid thousands for unnecessary remediation threatened lawsuits. And through it all, Karen tried to keep up her Queen Bee act, insisting it was all a misunderstanding, that Gary and Kevin were rogue contractors acting without her knowledge. But the harder she fought, the weaker she looked. Detective Harper knew the pressure alone might not break Karen, but the financial trail would. Subpoenas unearthed a staggering paper chain, HOA checks cashed into Dennis Cole's accounts, luxury purchases hidden under consulting expenses, even kickbacks routed through fake landscaping contracts. Every line item pointed to Karen as the ringleader, and with Bill's cooperation, the case shifted from suspicion to airtight prosecution. By the end of the week, Harper had assembled a case file thick enough to choke a binder. The district attorney's office began drafting indictments not only against Dennis and Karen, but also against secondary board members who had looked the other way. What had started as a petty neighborhood scheme was now being called one of the largest HOA corruption scandals in the county's history. For Mark, it was vindication. The same neighbors who had doubted him, whispered behind his back, or even accused him of rocking the boat, now saw the truth. He wasn't the troublemaker. He was the one who saved their homes, their money, and their peace of mind. But Karen wasn't done yet. Cornered and desperate, she began playing her final card: intimidation. Anonymous letters slipped under Mark's door. Strange cars idled outside his house at night. Someone even tried to slash his tires. It was the classic behavior of a collapsing tyrant, lashing out, hoping fear might buy her a little more time. What Karen didn't realize was that every desperate move only tightened the noose. Mark had built his case brick by brick, and now the law was standing beside him. The queen was running out of pawns, and the board was nearly cleared. The end came faster than anyone expected. With Bill's testimony, the lab reports, and the financial paper trail stacked like bricks in a wall, Karen and Dennis were indicted on charges ranging from fraud and racketeering to conspiracy and attempted grand larceny. The courtroom was packed on the first day of trial. Neighbors, reporters, even former board allies who now sat as witnesses. Karen tried her old tricks: the dramatic sighs, the self-pitying speeches about devoting her life to the community. But this time the mask cracked. When the prosecution played audio from her own emails, her voice dripping with arrogance as she mocked homeowners for being so easy to scare, the entire room shifted. There was no sympathy left. The guilty verdict was unanimous. Karen received a lengthy prison sentence, Dennis even longer, and Gary and Kevin cut deals that sent them behind bars too. The HOA board dissolved under court order, replaced by a temporary trustee appointed by the county. For the first time in years, the neighborhood could breathe. No more bogus inspections, no more threats disguised as compliance notices, no more queen bee tyranny dictating what color people could paint their doors. The air itself felt lighter, as if the whole community had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. But the story didn't end with Karen behind bars. It grew into something larger. Mark, once dismissed as a troublemaker, became a figure of respect. Neighbors who had avoided him now thanked him. Parents invited him to barbecues, kids asked about Scout the dog who had once barked warnings in the night. The sheriff's office praised his courage, and local papers hailed him as the man who broke the HOA mold scam. Yet Mark wasn't interested in glory, he wanted safeguards. He pushed county commissioners to pass reforms that would prevent any HOA from consolidating unchecked power Out of those efforts came a new ordinance, quickly nicknamed the Adler Amendment. The Adler Amendment required transparent audits of HOA finances, strict limits on emergency assessments, and, most importantly, an independent ombudsman residents could appeal to without fear of retaliation. For Mark, it wasn't just a legal victory, it was personal. It meant no family would ever again wake up to a fake mold inspector pounding on their door. No retiree would have to hand over their savings out of fear, and no Karen could turn neighbor against neighbor through manipulation. Karen's name, once spoken with either fear or false admiration, became a cautionary tale. Her story spread far beyond the neighborhood, used in HOA reform seminars, cited in legal articles, whispered in online forums as proof that corruption could be beaten if people stood up together. And every time Mark walked Scout along the lakefront, he could feel the difference. Laughter carried from porches, kids' bikes lined the sidewalks, and neighbors waved instead of glaring. Justice hadn't just put an end to Karen's empire. It had restored a community's soul. The Queen of Fear had fallen, but in her place rose something stronger, unity. And in that unity, Mark knew, there was no room for another tyrant to rise.